Today we have our third in conversation with VML, and I'm glad to say today it's Helen Kiely. Helen Kiely is an actress with VML, a character actress who's taken on a number of roles, but she's also quite outspoken on LGBTQ involvement in the arts, but I suppose rights in general. Hello, Helen.
Hello.
I've been looking forward to this because I think we never get the time to talk to the people who are involved with VML about things that interest them. And something that really interests me is how attractive the performing arts have been, certainly from the beginning of the 20th century until today, for the diverse people amongst us, for the LGBTQ community. And I was wondering, if you know, explain to our listeners exactly about your dissertations and that first.
Okay, so I've done my undergraduate dissertation and my first master's dissertation were both on aspects of masculine effeminacy in general, but certainly in relation to both society and cultural studies. So that covers anything that's like printed, any theatre, anything like that. And what that is it looks at the concept of what we would call sort of camp now, and sort of traces that through history with regards, and you find a lot of that appears in theatre. In fact, as much as it has gone in and out of fashion, I would say camp in particular has always been theatrical. So you get a lot of links between certainly the LGBT communities and actors from very early on. In sort of, I think it's because acting's never been until very recently a sort of a respected profession. It was always something that people who were sort of didn't have sort of traditional power could get on well in. And I think it calls to people. There's certainly quite a lot of theorists who say, you know, there's always been sort of a link between sort of homosexuality in particular and theatre, going well back into sort of Johnson and Shakespeare and things like that. That's always been something that existed.
I'm interested to sort of talk about this man who's popping up on our screen, Oscar Wilde. We kind of, when we think of the beginnings of homosexuality in popular theatre, we can't not mention dear old Oscar here, because he suffered a great deal for his homosexuality, and I think those people who know his work well can read so much into it that they wouldn't have realised, or other people, shall we say, wouldn't have realised he was gay just by his writing. But if you think of Algernon, for example, and the relationship between Algernon and Ernest, that's almost there's almost a sort of an undercurrent of a gay relationship going on there. I think always thought so.
Yeah, I think, and I think it's common as well for us looking back, or for anyone looking back through history, that we're very tempted to read like signs and signals of Wilde's sexuality in his work. And certainly in terms of theatre, you would say definitely in Ernest, but also in things like The Picture of Dorian Gray. There are very clear links to certainly things that Wilde found attractive in others, particularly in men. But Wilde is really interesting, and he is very important, both in the history of sort of theatre, but also in the history of how the sort of the evolution of homosexuality as an identity came about. Because it's really, although other people came before Wilde doing things like Wilde did, it was Wilde's fame and then his subsequent imprisonment that really created this image that we have of the kind of witty, debonair, very well dressed, very fashionable, very theatrical in his manner, sort of gay man that we would not, you know, we would recognize that as signs and symbols of his sexuality, which is sort of very interesting because it's very if you went back to sort of Shakespeare, Wilde's foppishness would be seen as being very macho, and what we would think as very sort of like that people always talk about. If you look at Othello is kind of coded slightly more what we would term as gay than we would read that. We wouldn't read him as that because he's a soldier and he's big and butch. But we'd be more likely to read Wilde style characters.
I mean, it's true to say that the importance of being honest itself was being performed at the time when Oscar Wilde was arrested and imprisoned, and then it was filmed, wasn't it?
It was.
The third. And how long was it before they performed it again?
Oh, I can't remember the exact year, but it was a long time after Wilde's death. Basically, it ran incredibly well. I mean, we were very lucky in VML to be able to perform it on the 125th anniversary of its opening night, which was the 14th of February. 4 days later, Wilde was getting that very famous card from the Marquis of Queensberry accusing him as posing as a sodomite, and that just led to everything that came after, to Wilde taking him to court, to prison, and to it becoming as well very dangerous for anyone else like Wilde to really stick their head above the parapet in England.
Of course, you can imagine how uncomfortable, shall we say, or difficult even for Wilde's friends. Anyone associated with Wilde would have driven themselves straight back into a closet.
Yes.
Almost like, Jesus being denied. Most of Oscar Wilde's friends would have denied any knowledge of him and any knowledge of his behaviour and that. But it's not.
Many of them did, but a lot of them also. There was I think there's a famous quote. I can't quite remember it, but there's something like after Wilde's arrest, the night trains to Paris were incredibly full of a certain type of English gentleman fleeing the country.
But I mean, we laugh, but it's not really funny, is it? It must have been a nightmare for them in them days. I mean, but the thing is, it's not that long then from Oscar Wilde's sort of trial until we get to the sort of the talking pictures to the movies in America, and to the studio system. And the reason I bring this up is because we've got this lady here now. This lady, who everybody should recognise as Marlene Dietrich, was one of the most masculine females in Hollywood, well known for being bisexual and preferring women to men, actually. I mean, we only know that through history because the studio were brilliant at covering this up or hiding. I mean, she never did, actually. She didn't in her private life, she didn't. But in the studio, they kept these people in the closet. I mean, it must have been difficult for women, for gay women, particularly in the days of early Hollywood, I would imagine.
Yeah, I imagine it will. I imagine it will be because, traditionally, female roles are always placed next to, if they're attractive, they're placed next to a male protagonist, and you're meant to be able to think you could fall in love with this woman. But then in the same way, that was also very equal to a lot of the men's experience. If you think of Cary Grant, for example, or Randolph Scott.
I only learned recently about Cary Grant and Randolph Scott's supposed affair. I'd not heard of that until very recently. I always associated Randolph Scott's for some reason. I associated him with Rock Hudson. I think there was a kind of connection between all of them, really. I think that they kind of were forced to stick together, really, I suppose. But it must be, for me, I think, thinking about it as we're chatting, I can't imagine how difficult it would be. I suppose it's bad enough now. I mean, if you see a young person who's struggling with their sexuality, although it's more free today than, let's say, was even in the 70s, go back to the 70s, but for a young man, for example, to struggle with his sexuality, and then that's difficult. But when you're in the limelight, when you've got, sort of women swooning at you, swooning in front of you kind of thing, and then the studio's making you out to be this big macho man. Not that you can't be gay and macho, I don't mean that. but there was no such thing as an effeminate hero, a leading man in Hollywood. I think that they were forced to hide that side of them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, it's very interesting when you look at the sort of particularly like at Rock Hudson. He comes up quite a lot in theories because he is such a masculine figure in terms of the roles that he played, and in some ways I think that would probably be both incredibly hard for him to then deal with, but also you've got to remember that at the time, of course, everybody was hiding. There certainly wasn't a pressure to come out. It was quite the opposite. They didn't want anybody to come out. Otherwise, the chances are your work would totally dry up. Dirk Bogarde is quite famous in that sense because he played in Victim, which came out in the sort of late 60s. He played a gay character who was blackmailed, a lawyer, and his agent, everyone around him told him not to do that part, but he was determined to do it, and it created. So it was one of the first sort of things where the actual male lead was a gay character.
Did you, when you were doing the research for your dissertations and looking into the art side of it, was there any shocks for you and any surprises really of people that you didn't realize were actually either gay or bisexual?
I think the trouble is I don't know if you saw Mark Haddon's program the other day on Aubrey Beardsley.
I didn't catch it, no.
But he sort of said, as a young man, he spent a lot of time researching things like Oscar Wilde wearing a green carnation and things like that. And I laughed my head off because that is exactly my entire teenage years. So I spent pretty much from the age of sort of 14 collecting newspaper clippings, anything that mentioned gay identity. I just gathered these things in a box. So it's hard to say that anything surprised me because I really was learning as I went along. I didn't have any expectations. So everything sort of came organically. I remember being surprised when I was maybe 16 about Ian McKellen because I had no idea. I mean, this is very early sort of internet days, so you didn't have the wealth of information you have. And I remember reading an article. My friend Sean used to sneak me copies of his Gay Times in brown envelopes through the school, and there was a massive interview with him, and I remember reading a lot about that because I had no idea really. You know what it's like when you live up here in the days before the internet. Everything you found out were these backwater scraps that you tucked away in little boxes. Yeah,
everything was. I mean, I did a lot of traveling in politics when I was a younger man. And I mean, particularly the Liberal Party by very nature of it being the Liberal Party kind of attracted, I think, more gay people into the party because there was a lot of people campaigning for gay rights, going back to the days of, I can't remember his name now, he was a campaigner, a Liberal campaigner. But then I think it was so, for me, even as somebody, as a kid growing up in a working class area, to come across all this at age 15, 16, it's quite shocking, really. Or it was back then, and it's not now. And I'm going back to the mid-70s. Yeah. It's really encouraging how we've come on. When you think of you think of people who have suffered all their lives, and you think, and I kind of feel a little bit more sorry for them now than I might have done then, because I think there's people, my friends and my children at school are saying I'm gay, and all the friends said, oh really, well done. Nobody's ostracizing them or demonizing them for being a different sexuality, and I find that really, really heartwarming. But I also find it like it must be like a smack in the mouth for all these people who've hidden all their lives and suddenly, I mean, you think there are famous people. I mean, you take sort of this guy, for example, talking about people hiding. Now, Kenneth Williams, he might not. I mean, he was a good friend of Joe Orton, wasn't he? They
He
used
was,
to go
yeah.
to. He used to go to Morocco. I think it was Morocco.
It
Every
was Morocco,
summer. Yeah, they used to go there every summer so they could pick up young men, things like that. And yet none of us watching Carry On films or listening to Round the Horn or all these sort of things realised. We just thought there was this man, this fabulous raconteur, was just what's the word? A bit eccentric, really. But he was playing with everybody. If you think about it in hindsight, using Polari, he was playing with his audience, really. And could you just explain to people who are listening what Polari is?
Yeah, so Polari is, it's sadly fallen very much out of favour now, but you can understand why. But Polari was a language or a slang language used basically by gay and lesbian women in gay men and lesbian women in Britain. Pretty much, I mean, some of it dates back a very long time, but it was certainly in active use from the turn of the century, the last century. And it was basically a way of speaking to each other so that you could pass messages and discuss things and basically pick up people without anyone else knowing what you were talking about. So there was things like, you know, people that go like Lily's around the corner, and that's Lily Law. So there were aspects of rhyming slang. There was some things came over after the Second World War with the American GIs, and it's a fantastic language, and it got developed as well when there were on the cruise liners. There were a lot of
I googled it
on that.
before because I knew we were having this conversation, and it actually began as well. I think the doctors used to use it as well in the early days, and I think there's a number of people, groups of people who suddenly have developed it over the years to the point where it became sort of like almost a common language amongst gay people in the days.
It was a very working class language as well. And it became well known as the language of theatre. Round the Horn was sort of the first time that you would hear it spoken, and I've just finished reading a book on the subject, actually, one of the most recent ones to come out, and they even said in Round the Horn it's very much diminished from what it was, but it was an amazing way to get around the censors. Some of the things that they say in the Julian and Sandy sketches are filthy. Some of them aren't, but some of them are absolute filth. And a lot of people say, oh, it got round the censors, but Hughie Green was the Director General at the time, and he grew up in music halls, so there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that he knew exactly what they were saying. And he just stuck up for them every time. When Mary Whitehouse or someone, apparently Mary Whitehouse never once complained about a Julian and Sandy sketch.
She obviously didn't understand it.
Exactly.
I mean, I suspect that's true for loads of people who just listen to it and just laugh, because I think he was a great character actor, Kenneth Williams, and I think it's really sad. He was a great Shakespearean actor as well, and I think it's really sad the way he was pigeonholed into the Carry On roles. And as much as we look back on them fondly, he's the same person in every single film, because that's what the box office was dictating, you know, rather than anything artistic about them. They were a quick money spinner, weren't they? Because they could do 2 or 3 a year. And I think it's sad but I also think now, and you have to be careful when you talk about diversity, when you talk about people, because there's so many different terms these days. It's not just lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. We've got pansexual, non-binary gender fluids. We've got, I mean, there's so much diversity on the spectrum that you have to be careful not to offend anybody and not to exclude anybody, really. And even saying something that I'm going to say now sounds a little bit, what do you mean by that? But I think Kenneth Williams would not have been the same person had he been straight.
No.
I think his sexuality and the way he had to play with it created the person that he became to the public. And but it also destroyed him in the end too.
Mm. I mean, he had a lot of other things going on, I know, but I think he was certainly, you know, there was some very strange things going on in Kenneth Williams' life about not letting other people use his toilet and things like that. There was a level of eccentricity.
He had
But
OCD, definitely.
yeah, well, but I think the thing is with any identity and any sexuality is that it cannot help but form you as a person in some way, because we learn our identities from the people around us and we learn it from the culture we are. In some ways, what you were saying earlier about like your kids at school now, they have access to new terms and new words that weren't there 5 years ago. They certainly weren't there 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think it's wonderful because it just gives people more opportunities. But it's very true that the way people have identified has changed over time. There's certainly a lot of people who, from sort of the Stonewall era, from the Stonewall riots, there were people even then who identified as women as opposed to identifying as gay men who wore drag. The lines were very much more blurred than perhaps they are now. And I think maybe those things might change. And just like talking about putting it in sort of a theatre context as well, I think it will change the way some things are done, if not a bit slowly. It was very interesting to me in the latest production of Cyrano de Bergerac, there was just this one line where they're pointing out somebody in the audience and they go, oh yeah, he's man, woman, gender fluid, you get what I mean? And he's like, oh no, he's too medieval to understand that. And it just kind of although obviously it's set in a long time ago, they sort of brought that to mirror things in the present day. And I think the thing is people have always existed in infinite variety. It's just maybe they've got new words to use, or we've got new words to describe ourselves.
You know, I've always thought, if we take theatre for example, take females, take women in theatre. I think historically, and it goes back to Shakespeare's day when women weren't allowed on the stage, so all the men played the women as well. I think women, there's not that wealth of characters around for women as there are for men still. I think if you look in the classics, there are very few roles if you weigh them against the major roles for men. And I think for me, I think it's time women got their own back. And as somebody that produces theatre, I can see myself one day really wanting to do an all-female Macbeth or something, or an all something like that, something that will I don't know, something that will give women a chance to sort of. I don't quite know what I'm saying, but you can get my point.
Yeah.
Go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I think that's true, and you can kind of understand it. Some people accuse Shakespeare of being a misogynist, and I don't think that's true at all. I think if you've got to write plays and you know your actors who are going to perform them, you aren't going to put a load of female roles in when you've only got two boys who can put pass decently in a dress. But I think some of that is slowly changing, and I think there's more openness now for people to play around with that. The Everyman did a production with a female Othello, but equally kept a female Desdemona a year or two ago, and that was really interesting the way they did that. And they played it very straight, but I wonder at what point maybe will it cease to be a gimmick and just be a thing where anyone can play anything.
And that's the issue, isn't it? That's the issue. If you do whatever you do in that vein, people will just see it as a gimmick. They will see it. Some people will get it, and some people will think, this is just art for art's sake. This is just doing this because they're trying to drag women into this and fit women into the male pigeonholes rather than creating really fabulous new stuff for women and balancing it out that way, really. And that's the issue. But it's funny, I was watching a Russell Howard stand-up show last night, and he was talking about when gay marriage became legal in this country, and Norman Tebbit had said, the one thing he said, well, if this sort of carries on, we could have a lesbian queen, which was his only bit of wisdom he could add to the debate. And I just think, well, why not?
Yeah, exactly. Why not?
I want to talk about this man. Now, this man is my absolute hero, okay? And I'm sure you've got a few things to say about this man. Right, Mr. Quentin Crisp.
Oh,
okay.
yes.
Now, I first became aware, I think, of diverse sexuality in the art when I sat down as a 15-year-old and watched The Naked Civil Servant when it first went out on TV. Played brilliantly by John Hurt, one of my heroes in acting. And it broke my heart as a young man to see what this guy actually went through, and the guts that he showed, and the fact that he was reaching for this unattainable goal. You know, there is no great dark man, he's famous for saying, because once you find him, if he wants you, then he's not what you're looking for.
He ceases to be a man.
He ceases to be a man, exactly. Yeah. And I think from his point of view, I think he went into sort of life modeling because there was very little else that he could do, really. But still, that's a sort of a way of performing, really, of putting himself out there. And I think that's what helped him survive as well. I think his flamboyance was his coping mechanism, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of people, and I think it can be a shield as well. One of the things that I do think about the joy of theatre is, and the attraction of it is that you get to dress up and be someone else and be looked at and be acknowledged, whilst keeping a bit of yourself quite safe, because you're taking on another role.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I find that with you, particularly as an actress, that you are strongest when you're being totally different to the Helen Kiely that everybody knows. You know, with Gwendolyn is I mean, I can't imagine Helen Kiely sort of saying half the things that Gwendolyn would say. I think somewhere in there there's the desire to, but I don't think you would. And also, of course, Ophelia, which for me was the first major role that you did for us.
It was, yeah.
An absolutely fabulous piece of theatre, which I'm really proud of. I'm proud of the whole of that production. So, have you, in your mind, is there anyone is there any character in classic theatre that you haven't played that you would like to play?
Oh, you asked me this question a few weeks ago, didn't you?
I did. I think I might have thought of an answer by now.
I gave you an answer then.
It was.
It was Iago from Othello, and Mephistopheles from Marlowe's Dr. Faustus.
Yeah, that's right. I remember.
I absolutely love just the language. I think the thing I love most about a lot of theatre is the sort of brilliant language that sort of comes to life. You know, you said there's not. I couldn't be like Gwendolyn in some ways, and that's basically because I haven't got Wilde's words spilling out of my mouth. I couldn't think of anything half so clever.
Well, maybe in hindsight, but also if you think, you know, if I was to throw, say, modern classics at you as an actress now, you know, like sort of, say for example, Bev in Abigail's Party. Who's busty and mouthy, or even Rita and Educating Rita. If we were to throw classics at them, do you think you could cope with that?
I think it would be a challenge, but I do enjoy a challenge. I think a lot of the roles that we've done have challenged aspects of me, because I find I have to find something of them that I understand in order to get them. Sort of the first. Before VML, one role that I always remember, because I think it was probably the first time that I'd really struggled to get a character and get in their head, was I played Jim in Tennessee Williams' Glass Menagerie, and I blooming hated Jim. He was awful, because I mean, he's just so boring. Everybody likes him, and everyone thinks he's wonderful. He thinks he's wonderful, and you just know he's going to grow up, get old, get bald, get a beer gut, and just be there polishing his Morris Minor or something. You just, oh, he's awful.
So he's got yeah.
And then what the one thing that I managed to get was in the script, there's this tiny bit where he stands up and he looks in the mirror and adjusts his tie. And then he starts doing this big speech to Laura. And I'm like, he's not speaking to her anymore. He thinks he's on a grand stage. And that, you know, and the minute I got that kind of little bit of vanity, little bit of showing off in my head, and recognised, yeah, I do that. You know, who doesn't interview themselves in the mirror at home in the privacy of their own bedroom? And so once I got that, I managed to sort of get under his skin a bit more. And I think that's been true of pretty much everything that we've done in VML. I've had to really get my head around a character who isn't like me at all. So it takes a lot of work. I think Abigail from The Crucible was probably the hardest, because she is sort of pure sort of sex appeal, which is not me. But so that took some doing to sort of get something of her viciousness. And I think there was something about her independence that I really liked, because she has her own plans and she doesn't stop for anybody but herself. And I think once I got that
character, Abigail, she very much, obviously she was a leader, even though she misled them all and led them all astray. And it's a shame that history doesn't let us know what happened to her. She kind of just disappeared.
No, I feel like I quite like it. I feel like she got on a boat and sailed away, and you know, with all her uncle's money, and very happy. She's the only one.
Everybody else, they all, you know, we know that, but Abigail just disappears into history. Okay, so let me just ask you then: do you see in the future of theatre in general, not VML so much, do you see a time when the male dominance in theatre will go, because it's still heavily male dominated? If you think the bulk of producers are men, the bulk of directors are men, and if you look at all the big sort of theatre, but if you look at like people like Cameron McIntosh and people like that, it seems to be dominated. It seems to be a sort of a matriarchal sort of organisation, theatre, really.
Yeah, I think
a patriarchal, sorry, not a matriarchal.
Patriarchal, yeah. I did get what you mean.
Yeah, you understood, but
yeah. But I think, I honestly don't know. I would hope that now that certainly, as we were saying, there's more understanding that there is more than one gender identity, and there is that there became more of a fluidity in theatre in general, and I would hope that carried over into things. But to be honest, you know, you mentioned about Russell Howard talking about gay marriage. I remember standing very confidently, age 17, and going, "Well, that'll never happen in my lifetime." So you never know. Maybe it'll surprise me. I think there's certainly, on the fringes, there are more opportunities for people to perform aspects of themselves in a more out way, that maybe break down those sort of masculine feminine boundaries. I recently watched a program, it's on YouTube at the moment, Teddy Lamb, who performed at the Edinburgh Fringe, and they are non-binary, and it was fantastic to see sort of such a moving performance of someone who comes across very confident with their identity. I follow them on Instagram, so you know, there's a lot more crossing over, but whether that will hit the mainstream again in my lifetime, I don't know.
I think it's what I think is really sad though is that in a lot of ways, I mean, let's talk about stand-up comedians for a second. If you think of people like Sarah Millican, for example, people like her, they very often have to err on the side of shocking the audience to get. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do, yeah.
Rather than, you know, I mean, John Bishop could stand there and talk about his children and wax lyrical about them and blah 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 blah. But for women, for some women, it's people expect them to be shocking, and I don't know why that is. I know, and she is. I mean, Sarah Miller can really, she can be really, you know, rude, and I think it's a shame that that we go from one extreme to another. Really, we go from Victoria Wood, who was just irreverent, I think, to Sarah Milligan, who shocks, really.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting though, because comedy has always been a very male-dominated field, in general. But if you consider that as sort of microcosm of theatre in general, and so anyone who was like gay men get assumed to be effeminate, and that's because they in a patriarchal society they get placed within the feminine aspect. And so you will find that traces through camp comedy very strongly. So you get, and it became a way of pushing the censors for them. It became a way of them pushing the censors and seeing what they could get away with. But it also was part of their a camp male comedian's routine. So if you would start with people like Kenneth Williams, and then go to sort of Larry Grayson and John Inman, where things were said more openly, and then you get down to Julian Clary, who made that very famous comment about Norman Lamont, because he crossed that line, and in some ways now that, and that was because it was the same kind of thing. So they were positive feminine. In order to continue to push those boundaries and get heard, they had to push that line between what was allowed to be said and what was not. Round the Horn did it subtly. John Inman did it more blatantly. And then sort of now you get sort of Julian Clary and Graham Norton. Now they're kind of old-fashioned and old hat. And we're seeing that in female comedians who would never have really appeared on a main stage. And Victoria Wood and Sarah Miller can kind of trace that same kind of history in my head.
Yeah, because and if you think back, I mean, I remember watching that award show when Julian Clary made that remark about Norman Lamont, but there wasn't a single person in that room who didn't laugh.
Oh no, because it shocked, and shocking gets you a laugh.
And it was okay for them to laugh, but then the poor guy was demonized the next day, and it ruined his career for a good while. But if we look at it now, it's so old-fashioned. Now,
totally.
If you think of Jimmy Carr, what Jimmy Carr comes out with, what Julian Clary said even then was nothing. There was nothing, and I think that women are following the same history. I think in time, hopefully, we'll learn to level out and to accept, because we're not saying comedian anymore, which I think is brilliant. You know, we're not putting a sexual identity. We don't actually say actress as much anymore. We call all genders actor and comedian, and I think that's right, because we're all doing the same thing. Everybody's doing the same thing. So why should you be separated by your gender? Because if you want,
or more worryingly, it's always by what people perceive your gender to be, which is always a sort of minefield.
It's getting more a minefield these days than ever, though. I think it's very difficult not to put your foot in it these days, even with really well-meaning, good intentions. You can really misinterpret, or you can be misinterpreted.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, though, I think if people have good intentions, the vast majority of people understand. I think, like I said before, you know, now that more and more people are online, I think the hardest thing for us who grew up without the internet is just we being able to keep up. And as long as people have good intentions and mean well, people will understand that.
But even
that you're trying.
Yeah, you go back 15 years, 15 years when Facebook started. The Facebook generation now are just old fogies. You know, Facebook is for older people. now there's TikTok and Instagram and WhatsApp and everything else. Facebook and Twitter are for older people now. And I think the internet kind of evolves the same way as real life does. I think it matures, and I think it's brilliant for the industry that, you know, for people like in the performing arts. I think it's great, gets people out there. It's great as a networking tool, but it's also very dangerous. And it can sort of, for me, the worry for me really is that it can, with the right angle, make the unacceptable acceptable. The internet, you know, and children can latch onto things very easy and can access so much these days. And you wonder how much is, you know, we talk about nature and nurture and learned behavior, and you wonder how much learned behavior is actually coming from the internet and not from the family home or the school these days. And I think that's true in terms of how we behave as human beings, in terms of bigotry and isms and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, that's a bit heavy for the end of this conversation.
Well, let's just say as well that one of the advantages of the internet at the moment is the fact that now that we all can't go out and see each other, there is so much amazing theatre that has become online, more than people from sort of our neck of the woods would ever be able to see. You know, we're seeing all these amazing productions being made available to people, and
that's always been a bugbear of mine, that theatre is seen as elitist, and it's made elitist by theatre prices and
it's London centric.
But now it's different. Now people are accessing it online. I hope they carry on doing this. Really, I think it's worth doing for people who can't get to big theatres, because you know as well as I do that yes, it's wonderful watching the theatre that they're putting on the internet at the moment, but there's nothing beats being there, seeing the performance happen in front of you in the flesh. For example, when I went to see Endgame, to see Daniel Radcliffe playing this amazing character just there right in front of you, can't beat that. You can't, you know, you wouldn't get that same flavour on the internet watching it that way.
No, there's a very famous theory, and I genuinely wish I could remember it, but there was this when the invention of photography occurred, a lot of people were saying, well, have you really seen a piece of artwork until you've stood in front of it, because the experience is totally different? Or does it remove some of the soul for it to be photographed and shared?
No, I completely understand that. I completely understand that. And I suppose one of the things, for different reasons as well, I mean, you see people going to the Louvre when they're in Paris and looking at the Mona Lisa and think, no, it's so small. That's the first thing. Oh, it's so small, it's very tiny. You expect it to be this massive picture, and you know, it's very small. But then I suppose it's the most valuable painting in the world, and you can go and look and think it's so small, but what does it have that makes it so, you know? And you don't get that in a picture. You really don't. In a photograph, you don't.
Yeah.
Helen, I'm going to leave it there. Okay? I want to say thank you for doing this with me. It's actually been a joy to get to know Helen Kiely a bit tonight. You know, the member of the group that sits at the back, all quiet and unassuming, to actually, you know that, you know. I mean, I think it's quite interesting for the group as well to know that you do actually have opinions, you know, because you're one of the quiet members of the group who kind of sees all and says nothing. Is there anything you'd like to add before we finish?
I think one thing that I think we can take from discussing the idea of diversity in theatre is theatre's often been a safe place for people, and I think that VML is a safe place, and I hope that continues no matter what happens in sort of the theatre world in the future. And our hopes for equality, I hope that it continues to be a safe place for those of who haven't got anywhere else, to give them that opportunity to just sort of be themselves by being someone else.
You know, that's a lovely thing to say, because that's why I started it. That's exactly why I started it. To look after the people who will find that safe place and feel that they can develop with us, really. and then let them go and fly to pastures new and bigger and better things. But at least, you know, we've touched their lives in a positive way and grounded them in some ways, I suspect. I hope.
Yeah.
Helen,
Yeah.
it's been lovely speaking to you. See you soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye
Thanks.
now.
Bye.